When I first arrived at the secluded campground in Colorado, I didn't think anything of it. But looking back, that was my first mistake. I'm Kevin Parker. It was late September and I had just finished a really stressful, months-long project at work. I felt completely burned out, so I decided to take a long weekend and drive up into the mountains for some solo camping. I just wanted to disconnect for a few days, read a book by a fire, and be far away from cell service and computer screens. I booked a spot at a state park that was known for being pretty quiet, especially later in the camping season. When I pulled up to the small wooden ranger station on Thursday afternoon, the guy at the desk handed me a map and mentioned that I practically had the entire North Loop to myself. My assigned spot was Site 42. It was situated at the very end of a long, winding gravel road, surrounded by massive pine trees that blocked out most of the late afternoon sunlight. Directly across the dirt road from me was Site 43. As I parked my car and got out to stretch my legs, I noticed that 43 was completely empty. There was no vehicle, no tent, and no camping gear whatsoever. It was just a flat dirt pad, an old wooden picnic table, and a metal fire ring. The plastic reservation tag clipped to the wooden post was blank. I spent the first hour or so setting up my tent and organizing my gear. The mountain air was already getting cold, so I wanted to get a fire going before the sun went down completely behind the tree line. I had a heavy, bright yellow flashlight that I always kept handy for trips like this. I specifically remember taking it out of my green duffel bag and placing it right on the corner of the wooden picnic table. I turned around, opened the trunk of my car, and spent maybe 3 or 4 minutes digging around for my bundle of firewood and a small hatchet. When I walked back to the picnic table and dropped the wood onto the dirt, I reached out for the flashlight. It wasn't there. I stopped and looked at the bare wooden planks of the table. I checked the ground around the table, thinking maybe it had rolled off the edge and fallen into the dirt. I checked the pockets of my jacket, even though the flashlight was way too big to fit in them. I walked back to my open trunk and moved the remaining bags around, checking underneath my sleeping bag and cooler. The flashlight was just gone. It was strange, but I figured I must have absent-mindedly set it down somewhere else while I was carrying things around the site. I ended up just using the flashlight app on my phone for the rest of the evening. The woods were incredibly quiet. The only things I heard were the wind moving through the upper branches of the pines and the occasional pop from my campfire. I went to sleep around 10 p.m. without giving the missing flashlight another thought. The next morning, Friday, the air was freezing. I woke up early, unzipped my tent, and started boiling some water on my small portable camp stove. I have a green enamel coffee mug that I take on every camping trip. I poured my hot coffee, set the mug flat on top of my cooler, and turned around to grab my boots from just inside the tent flap. I sat down on a thick log by the fire pit, laced up my boots tightly, and stood up to grab my coffee. The mug was gone. I stood there staring at the white plastic lid of the cooler. There was a faint, wet ring of condensation right where the hot mug had been sitting just a minute ago. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. Misplacing a flashlight is one thing, but a steaming hot mug of coffee doesn't just vanish into thin air. I walked around my entire campsite, looking everywhere. I checked behind the tent, near the tree line, and underneath my car. I even looked inside the car. Nothing. I looked across the dirt road. Site 43 was still completely empty. The morning sun was hitting the dirt pad, and there was absolutely no sign of anyone over there. There was no movement in the trees behind it. I tried to tell myself an animal must have grabbed it, even though a raccoon running off with a full cup of hot coffee didn't make much sense. I really tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I locked my car, grabbed my backpack, and spent the entire afternoon going on a long hike on a trail that looped around a nearby lake. I didn't see another person the entire time. It was beautiful and peaceful, and by the time I started heading back to my campsite, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid and forgetful. I got back to Site 42 around 5 p.m. The sun was already starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the gravel road. I own 2 identical blue folding canvas chairs. I usually set one up near the fire and leave the other folded up, leaning against the back bumper of my car just in case I need it for something. As I walked up to my site, I noticed the back of my car looked bare. The folded chair was missing. I stopped dead in my tracks. My stomach dropped. A missing flashlight and a coffee mug were weird. but a large, heavy canvas folding chair was entirely different. An animal definitely couldn't carry that away without making a ton of noise. I started walking the perimeter of my site, scanning the dense trees. The silence of the woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. I walked out to the gravel road and looked in both directions. The road was completely empty. Then, I looked across the road at Site 43. In the fading light, I noticed a strange shape sitting right next to the metal fire ring. I slowly walked across the gravel road, my boots crunching loudly in the quiet air. As I got closer to the empty fire pit, I saw it clearly. Sitting perfectly upright next to the cold ashes was my blue folding chair. Resting right in the center of the canvas seat was my green enamel coffee mug, and standing straight up perfectly inside the mug was my yellow flashlight. I just stood there staring at the arrangement. It was set up so neatly, almost like a strange display. Someone had been coming into my campsite, taking my things one by one while my back was turned, and placing them over here at the empty site. I quickly grabbed all 3 items. I hurried back to my campsite and immediately locked the chair and the flashlight in my trunk. I kept looking over my shoulder at the tree line. The woods felt entirely different now. Every shadow looked darker and the trees felt way too close. I seriously debated packing up and leaving right then, but the sun was almost entirely gone and I didn't want to break down my tent and pack my car in the pitch dark. I decided I would sleep in my car if I had to, but the thought of leaving my expensive tent and gear out all night bothered me. I ended up zipping myself into my tent early and bringing my heavy hatchet inside with me. That night was awful. I lay perfectly still on top of my sleeping bag, just listening to the woods. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard a sound outside. It was a slow, shuffling noise in the dry pine needles. It sounded exactly like heavy footsteps, moving very carefully just outside the thin nylon walls of my tent. The sound moved from the front of the tent, slowly walked around the right side, and then stopped right near the back corner, just inches from my head. I held my breath. I waited for the sound of the zipper moving, or a hand pressing against the fabric. But nothing happened. After about 20 minutes of complete silence, I finally exhaled. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started getting slightly light on Saturday morning, I was out of my sleeping bag. I was done. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend. I just wanted to leave immediately. I started tearing down my camp as fast as I could. I threw my sleeping bag into the back seat of the car and started pulling the metal stakes out of the ground to collapse the tent. I had a small canvas bag of spare metal tent stakes that I always kept just inside the front door of the tent, tucked into a little mesh pocket. When I reached for the pocket to pack the other stakes away, I realized it was empty. The canvas bag was gone. I felt a tight knot form in my throat. I stood up and immediately looked across the gravel road at Site 43. The site looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Empty table, empty fire pit. But as I scanned the far edge of the dirt pad, right where it met the thick brush of the dark woods, I noticed something unnatural. It was a piece of blue plastic. It looked like a small tarp, bunched up and partially covered with dry pine needles and loose dirt so it would blend in. I walked across the road. My heart was beating heavily against my ribs. I approached the edge of the woods and used the toe of my boot to kick the dirt and pine needles away. I reached down and pulled the edge of the blue tarp back. Lying underneath the tarp was my canvas bag of spare tent stakes. Next to the bag was a cheap, plastic, disposable camera, and sitting right beside the camera was a small stack of printed photographs. I knelt down and picked up the stack of photos. There were 5 of them. The glossy paper felt cold against my skin. I looked at the first picture. It was a shot of my car, taken from somewhere deep in the trees across the road. The lighting suggested it was taken late Thursday afternoon, right around the time I arrived. I flipped to the second photo. It was a picture of me. I was sitting on the log by my fire pit, looking down at my boots. The picture was taken from a distance, framed by dark out-of-focus branches. The third photo showed me walking back from the hiking trail, carrying my backpack. The fourth photo was a picture of Site 43. It showed my blue folding chair, my green mug, and my yellow flashlight perfectly arranged next to the empty fire pit. My hands started shaking. I slowly moved the fourth picture to the back of the stack and looked at the fifth and final photo. It was a picture of my green sleeping bag and my duffel bag. But the picture wasn't taken from the woods. The edges of the photo clearly showed the orange nylon fabric of my tent walls. The angle was looking down at my sleeping bag from the back right corner of the tent. The picture was taken from inside my tent. I dropped the photos in the dirt. I didn't even bother grabbing my spare stakes or the tarp. I turned around and ran back to my campsite. I didn't finish taking the tent apart properly. I just pulled the poles out, bunched the massive pile of nylon together, and shoved it all into the back seat of my car. I threw the cooler into the trunk, slammed it shut, and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. I threw the car into drive and sped down the gravel road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust behind me. I didn't look in my rearview mirror until I was completely out of the state park and back on the paved highway. I drove for 3 hours straight without stopping once. When I finally got back to my apartment, I was exhausted and on edge. I spent the next hour pulling all my disorganized, dirty gear out of the car and carrying it up the stairs to my place. When I went back down to the parking lot to grab the very last few things from the passenger side, I opened the door and noticed something resting right in the middle of the passenger seat. It was one of my metal spare tent stakes. Have you ever found an item of yours in a place that made absolutely no sense? I remember that weekend clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at a small private campground in Montana, but it did. I'm Grace Morgan. Last October, I took a week off from my job in the city to clear my head and spend some time outdoors. I loaded up my silver Tacoma with my tent, a cooler full of food, and enough camping gear to last me a few days. I drove about 4 hours north into a very rural, heavily wooded part of the state. I had booked a spot at a small, privately owned campground that I found online. The reviews said it was incredibly quiet, mostly because it was off the main highway and had zero cell service. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I arrived at the campground around 3 in the afternoon on a Friday. The property was heavily forested, with tall pine trees casting long, dark shadows over the dirt roads. The main office was just a small, single-room log cabin near the entrance. When I walked inside, the place was empty. There was a sign on the front counter explaining that the owners lived off-site during the off-season. Check-in was completely self-serve. You just had to take an envelope, put your cash inside, and drop it into a metal lockbox mounted to the wall. I filled out the front of my envelope, dropped my cash into the slot, and grabbed a paper map from the counter. My assigned spot was Site 12. It was located at the very back of the property, at the end of a long gravel loop. When I pulled up to my site, I was completely alone. There were no other cars or tents anywhere on my side of the campground. Site 12 was basically just a dirt clearing surrounded by dense woods. About 50 yards away, just past the edge of the trees, there was an old wooden storage shed. The paint was peeling off the sides, and the roof was covered in thick, dark moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't think much of it and spent the next hour setting up my tent and organizing my campsite. Later that afternoon, I realized I needed some firewood. The sign in the office mentioned that there was an honor system wood stack located behind the cabin. I walked the 10 minutes down the gravel road back to the main office. The cabin was still empty, but the front door was unlocked. I went inside to see if there was a price list for the wood. Sitting right in the middle of the front counter was a standard, blue, spiral-bound notebook. It was labeled Visitor Logbook in faded black marker. The book was open to the middle. Out of sheer curiosity, I glanced down at the page. The entries were written in very neat, small handwriting using black ink. Most of them were basic observations about the campground. Things like, Site 4 left early, or trash cans emptied at main gate. Then, I looked at the very last entry on the page. It was dated Thursday. The entry read, Silver Tacoma pulling into Site 12. I stood there and stared at the page. I drove a silver Tacoma and I was staying at Site 12. But I had just arrived on Friday afternoon. I wasn't even in the state on Thursday. I felt a brief moment of confusion, but I quickly brushed it off. I figured whoever was keeping the logbook had just written down the wrong day, or maybe another silver truck had pulled in and left before I got there. It was a weird coincidence, but not impossible. I grabbed a bundle of firewood, dropped a few dollars in the lockbox, and walked back to my site. That first night was incredibly peaceful. I built a fire, made some dinner, and sat in my folding canvas chair, reading a book by the light of the flames. The woods were dead silent, except for the occasional sound of wind moving through the upper branches. Around 10:30, the fire started dying down to just glowing orange coals. I closed my book and stood up to stretch. As I turned toward my tent, I heard a sound coming from the direction of the old storage shed. It sounded like a slow, heavy footstep snapping a dry branch. I stopped moving and listened. I stood perfectly still for about 2 minutes, staring into the dark trees. There was no more sound. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. I zipped myself into my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, the air was freezing. I woke up, boiled some water for coffee, and decided I wanted to go for a hike. I remembered seeing a stack of trail maps in the office, so I put on my boots and walked back down the gravel road. When I stepped inside the empty office, my eyes went straight to the blue notebook on the counter. It was still sitting in the exact same spot. I walked over to the counter and looked down at the open page. There was a new entry written underneath the one about my truck. It was dated Friday night. The entry read, Site 12 sitting by fire, reading until 10:30 p.m. My stomach dropped. I placed both of my hands flat on the wooden counter and stared at the neat black handwriting. That was exactly what I had done. I had been reading, and I had put my fire out right around 10:30. The uneasy feeling settled deep in my chest. Someone had been watching me last night. I looked out the front window of the cabin, scanning the empty dirt parking lot and the tree line. The campground was completely deserted. I didn't take a trail map. I left the office and walked briskly back to my campsite. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time the wind shifted the trees, I felt like someone was standing just out of sight. When I got back to Site 12, everything was exactly how I had left it. My tent was zipped up, my cooler was latched, and my car was locked. I spent the entire afternoon sitting at my picnic table, just watching the woods. I didn't go on my hike. By the time the sun started going down on Saturday evening, the shadows in the campground were getting long and dark. The temperature dropped quickly. I felt incredibly isolated. I decided I didn't want to stay another night. I wanted to pack up my car and leave right then, but I needed to call my sister first to let her know I was heading home early. Since I didn't have cell service, I had to use the landline phone located inside the campground office. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the gravel road one last time. The woods felt entirely different in the dark. The silence felt heavy. When I reached the office, I pushed the wooden door open and walked straight to the wall phone hanging near the back corner. I picked up the receiver and started dialing the numbers. While the phone was ringing against my ear, I turned around and leaned against the wall. From where I was standing, I had a clear view of the front counter. The blue notebook was still there, but the pen, which had been resting next to it earlier, was now sitting directly on top of the open pages. I slowly walked over the counter, keeping the phone pressed to my ear. I looked down at the notebook. There was a brand new entry. The ink looked shiny and wet in the dim light of the cabin. The entry read, Saturday, 6:45 p.m. Site 12, walking to the office alone. I looked up at the cheap plastic clock hanging on the wall above the door. It was exactly 6:46. I felt sick. I dropped the phone receiver. It dangled toward the floor, making a loud, continuous beeping sound. Whoever was writing this was here right now. They had watched me walk down the road just a minute ago. I slowly backed away from the counter and looked out the front window of the cabin. The campground was pitch black. I turned off my flashlight and pressed my face close to the glass, trying to see any movement in the dark. As my eyes adjusted, I looked past the dirt parking lot, toward the far edge of the property where the gravel loop started. I could just barely see the outline of the old, rusted storage shed near my campsite. The heavy wooden door of the shed was hanging open about an inch. I noticed a very faint, pale light glowing from inside the gap. It was incredibly dim, like the light from a small battery-powered lantern. I didn't go back to my campsite. I didn't even care about my tent or my gear. I just wanted my car keys, which were in my jacket pocket, and I wanted to leave. But I couldn't stop looking at that shed. Whoever was watching me was inside there. I slowly pushed the office door open and stepped out into the cold air. I didn't turn my flashlight on. I walked across the dirt lot, keeping to the edge of the trees, moving quietly toward the back of the property. The only sound was my boots softly hitting the dirt. When I got within 20 feet of the shed, I stopped. The light inside was still on, but there was no sound coming from within. I crept closer until I was standing right next to the peeling wooden wall. I reached out and carefully pulled the door open wider. It made a soft scraping noise against the concrete floor. I looked inside. The shed smelled like gasoline and rotting wood. There were old rusted tools leaning against the walls, and a thick layer of dust covered the floor. But there was no one in there. In the back corner of the small room, there was a folding metal table. A small electric lantern was sitting on it, casting a weak, pale light over the surface. Resting directly under the lantern was a second notebook. This one wasn't a cheap spiral notebook. It was a thick, heavy, leather-bound book. I walked over to the table and looked down. The cover was worn around the edges. I slowly reached out and opened the cover. The pages were completely filled with writing. It was the same neat, black handwriting from the office. I flipped through the pages. There were hundreds of entries dating back years. They were all detailed descriptions of people. License plate numbers, physical descriptions, the clothes they were wearing, the exact times they went to sleep, and the exact times they woke up. Some entries detailed people sleeping in their cars. Others described people leaving their tents unlocked. It was a massive, obsessive catalog of every person who had ever stayed at the campground. My hands were shaking as I flipped toward the very end of the book, to the most recent pages. I turned to the last page that had writing on it. The rest of the page was completely blank, except for the very top line, where someone had already written my full name. Have you ever found something that proved you were being watched? At first, I thought it was just my imagination while I was at a reserved campsite in California, until it happened again. I'm Jenna Hughes. Last summer, I managed to get a 4-day reservation at a state park in the northern part of the state. It was deep in the redwoods, miles away from any major towns or highways. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. On the drive up, I stopped at the small local grocery store about an hour outside the park to stock up on supplies. I remember the cashier handing me a long paper receipt, which I casually shoved into the side mesh pocket of my blue camping cooler before driving the rest of the way to the park. When I arrived, the ranger at the entrance station gave me a map, a parking tag, and a brass key attached to a frayed yellow lanyard. He explained that the key was for the bear-proof storage box at my site. Black bears were highly active in the area, so every single piece of food, trash, and anything with a scent had to be locked inside the heavy metal box at all times. My spot was Site 58. It was located at the very end of a dirt loop, surrounded by massive, ancient trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The site was completely isolated from the rest of the campground. I couldn't even see the main dirt road through the thick brush. The bear box was sitting at the edge of the clearing, pushed far back against a dense wall of blackberry bushes and thick ferns. It was a large dark green metal container, bolted directly to a concrete pad in the dirt. It had a heavy steel handle and a thick metal loop on the front where the padlock went. I spent the afternoon setting up my tent. When it was time to make dinner, I unlocked the bear box, took out my cooler, and made sure to lock the bear box, took out my cooler, and made sure to lock the padlock again while I cooked. Before going to sleep, I packed everything back inside, snapped the heavy padlock shut, and gave the metal handle a hard pull to make sure it was secure. It didn't budge. I slipped the key lanyard around my neck and went into my tent for the night. The first night passed without any issues. I woke up around 7 a.m., unzipped my tent, and walked over to the dark green box to get my coffee supplies. I unlocked the heavy padlock, pulled the steel handle, and swung the heavy metal door open. When I reached inside to grab my dry food bag, I noticed something sitting in the far right corner of the metal floor. It was a crumpled plastic wrapper from a brand of beef jerky that I didn't buy. I stood there looking at it for a few seconds. I hadn't seen it in there yesterday when I was loading my things. I figured the previous camper must have left it behind, and it had just been pushed into the dark corner where I missed it in the fading light. I picked it up, threw it into my designated trash bag, and didn't think much else about it. I spent that entire day hiking a long loop trail that took me miles away from the campground. I didn't get back to Site 58 until late in the afternoon. The campground was dead quiet. I unlocked the bear box, made my dinner, locked it back up, and sat by the fire pit until it got dark. I made sure to check the interior of the box with my flashlight before locking it for the night. It was completely clean. I pulled the handle, confirmed it was locked, and went to bed. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise. It was a dull, metallic scraping sound coming from outside. It sounded exactly like heavy metal sliding its metal, followed by a soft thud. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. The sound didn't happen again. I assumed it was just a raccoon trying to get at the locked box. I eventually went back to sleep. When morning came, I walked out of my tent and went straight to the bear box. The padlock was perfectly in place, still snapped tightly shut through the metal loop. I took the key from around my neck, unlocked the padlock, and opened the door. My stomach dropped. Sitting right in the center of the metal floor, directly next to my blue cooler, was a dirty white paper plate. Resting on top of the plate was an apple core. I just stared at it. The apple core wasn't completely brown yet. It was fresh. The paper plate had greasy smudges on it. I hadn't eaten an apple, and I only brought reusable plastic bowls with me on the trip. I felt incredibly uneasy. I looked down at the key in my hand, then at the heavy padlock. There was no way to open the front of this box without the key. I had worn the lanyard around my neck the entire night. I checked the hinges on the front door, looking for any signs that someone had tried to pry it open, but the thick steel was perfectly intact. I looked around the campsite. The massive redwoods suddenly felt very intimidating. I was completely alone out here, and someone had somehow bypassed a lock steel box to throw their trash away. I took a plastic bag, picked up the paper plate and the apple core, and threw them away. I locked the box again and spent the entire morning just sitting at my picnic table watching the tree line. Something felt off. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed right at the site, keeping the bear box in my line of sight. Nobody came by. The dirt loop remained empty. By the time evening arrived, the isolation was really starting to get to me. I ate a quick dinner, packed everything back into the metal box, and double-checked the padlock 3 different times. I even took my heavy flashlight and shined it all around the back of the box, but it was pushed so tightly against the thick wall of blackberry bushes that I couldn't see much. I got into my tent as soon as it got dark. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there in the dark, listening. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard it again. It was the same heavy metallic scraping sound. It was coming right from the edge of my campsite. This time, it was followed by the distinct sound of something plastic crinkling. I held my breath. I waited for the sound of footsteps walking away, but I didn't hear any feet hitting the dirt or gravel. The woods just went completely silent again. I stayed awake until the sun finally came up. As soon as there was enough light to see, I unzipped my tent and walked over to the bear box. The padlock was still secure. I unlocked it and pulled the door open. The inside of the box was filled with garbage. There were 3 crushed beer cans, a torn empty bag of potato chips, a handful of dirty paper napkins, and a dark, damp rag, all shoved carelessly between my cooler and my dry bags. The smell of stale beer and rotting food hit my face. I stumbled backward. This wasn't just a random wrapper anymore. Someone was actively using my locked storage box as their personal trash can, and they were doing it while I was sleeping just 20 feet away. I walked around to the side of the metal box. It was bolted securely to the concrete pad. I looked at the thick wall of blackberry bushes pressing up against the back panel. The bushes were incredibly dense, but as I looked closer, I noticed that some of the thorny branches right near the ground were broken and pushed aside. I squeezed myself between the side of the metal box and the edge of the bushes. The thorns caught on my jacket, but I pushed forward until I could see the back panel of the heavy steel container. There was a second door. It was a smaller, rectangular metal hatch built directly into the back of the box, completely hidden from the campsite. It had a simple sliding latch on the outside, with no padlock. I reached out and pulled the latch. The metal hatch slid open smoothly, making that exact dull scraping sound I had heard during the night. Through the opening, I could see the back of my blue cooler and the pile of trash sitting inside. I pushed past the back of the box, stepping fully into the thick brush. Once I got past the first layer of blackberry thorns, the vegetation opened up. There was a narrow, heavily worn dirt trail leading directly away from the back of the bear box and deeper into the dark trees. I walked very slowly, my boots barely making a sound on the soft pine needles. The trail snaked through the massive redwood trunks for about 50 yards before ending in a small, concealed clearing. The clearing was a hidden camp. There was a filthy, dark green sleeping bag spread out on the dirt, surrounded by empty beer cans and food wrappers. Piled up next to the sleeping bag was a massive mound of camping gear. There were high-end flashlights, expensive hiking boots, portable stoves, water bottles, and several backpacks. It was a collection of items taken from different campsites around the park. I took a step closer to the pile. Lying on the dirt, weighed down by a heavy flashlight, was a piece of white paper. I reached down and picked it up. It was a long paper receipt. I looked at the faded black ink. It listed a bag of ice, 2 packs of hot dogs, and a bag of trail mix. The date and time at the top were from the exact hour I had stopped at the small grocery store before arriving at the park. It was the receipt I had shoved into the exterior mesh pocket of my cooler on the first day. The same cooler that was currently sitting inside my locked storage box. Have you ever discovered a hidden area near somewhere you were staying?